Hello, everybody. We'll get started. I am Ian Williams. I am the president of the Foreign Press Association in New York. And as the Olympics limp to the finishing line, we have nuclear games with us. We have Alan Ware and Wanda Proskova, who have introduced their program on the nuclear games. And the video link, which we've sent out to many of you, I hope you've seen it. But we need to go over some of the background. Obviously, this is Japan. Japan is the first victim of actual nuclear bombing at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that's almost exactly the anniversary coming up, August the 6th. It's one of the anniversaries which seems to stick in my mind. It's also not that far. It's an anniversary for Fukushima, when the tsunami rushed over the nuclear power plant, which leads to thoughts which we'll get back to later about why is it that people always want to build nuclear power plants on geological fissures and skip splits and next to the sea in tsunami zones, or on the River Hudson with Indian Point, for example, near a city. There seems to be a particular form of madness afflicts nuclear designers and architects, whatever you think about the nuclear power itself. And the news came yesterday that the International Olympic Committee, you know, those wonderful people who gave you the 1936 games and haven't changed much since, had refused to a plea from the mayor of Hiroshima and the mayor of Nagasaki to have 1 minute silence in token of the memory of the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this is fairly stunning. I mean, for many years at the UN, one of the most popular exhibits was of relics from Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the visitors' lobby. Most visitors were just sort of stunned and looked at these charred limestone images of the Virgin Mary in one case, of the melted ceramics, the melted coins, and just got a sort of tangential view of just how horrendous a nuclear explosion can be. So Alan is going to explain to us what the campaign is doing, how the film was made, and I hope you've seen the film. It was quite, it was an impressive mix of graphics and narration. And Wanda, both of them are in Czechia, by the way. See, I said Czechoslovakia, Czechia, or the Czech Republic, depending on your parlance, and are pushing for the nuclear games international networks of youth to counter the nuclear threat, menace, or even to just inform people about nuclear power. Alan and I have worked for many years. We were working about the victims in the Marshall Islands and other places, restitution for the Pacific Islanders who were alternatively bombed and dispossessed by for the defense of freedom, as shows graphically in the film. So, Alan, over to you. Please explain what this is all about and how it's tied in with the Olympics. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you to the Foreign Press Association for inviting Wanda and myself to be able to talk about this really exciting and innovative new initiative, platform, communication tool, which is nuclear games. So I'll talk a little bit about the background behind it and how it came about, and then Wanda will talk a little bit more about what it actually is and how to engage and interact with it. As you mentioned, I've been involved in this issue for many years. I originally come from New Zealand. We were witnessed the nuclear testing in our area of the world, the Pacific, and the devastation that was causing on peoples in the area. And we also saw the threat of nuclear weapons and the confrontation between the nuclear powers. So my country, New Zealand, took action and banned both nuclear energy and nuclear weapons because of the dangers of both. But we still have the risks and dangers of both in the world. So nuclear games was established from an idea from Dr. Andreas Niedecker, who lives in Basel, Switzerland, who was very long time involvement in the international physicians for the prevention of nuclear war, the Nobel Peace prize-winning organization. And it's looking at both issues, nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, and the risks of both, the radiation risks from the accidents from nuclear power plants, the risks of nuclear war from the nuclear weapons, and the very fact that even the production and the testing of these has caused hardships. But what Dr. Niedecker was seeing is that despite there being a lot of evidence, and a lot of information about these risks, young people weren't really getting involved. And so the knowledge wasn't being passed to the next generation, the knowledge that many of us have had who have been involved for a long time through the historical events like the Cuban Missile Crisis. I wasn't alive then, but my parents were. And other, the Chernobyl disaster up until the Fukushima disaster. A lot of the historical knowledge was not being passed on. And how to do this, Dr. Niedecker consulted with others and realized that what people like is stories. They like to actually find out what's happening to people and what role do people play and how does it impact people, and not just politics and information and statistics. So he chose 5 stories from the nuclear age across the span of the world and the different issues. One is Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Soviet commander of a submarine who basically prevented the Soviets from firing nuclear torpedoes because they thought they were being attacked. And so probably, helped ensure we didn't have a nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, there are other players as well, but that's one of the stories. Another one is uranium mining in Niger and the division in the community and hostage taking and some crazy stuff happening. Another one is the nuclear testing in the Pacific and the fact that there are populations who can never go back to their homelands because of the nuclear testing. Another is the Chernobyl and the stories of liquidators. And another is the North Korean nuclear weapons program. But they all sort of tie together sort of with an idea of there is still this crazy race to whether it's nuclear energy or nuclear weapons. And it's at odds with the idea of the Olympics, which is supposed to be there for peace and a competition to build peace between nations. And in fact, the Olympics started with an Olympic truce. This was back in the time of the Greeks. They actually declared a truce between the cities of the time of the Olympics. And that truce was revived by the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, and the United Nations. So both of them honor this idea of the Olympics as being for peace. And sometimes it's worked quite well and been used very well. We saw the 2018 Winter Olympics in South Korea, where that idea of the Olympic truce was embodied and taken forward and started a peace process between North and South Korea, the summits. And there was hopes that the Olympics in Japan would take forward some of these similar ideals, of peace and do something to highlight those. And in particular, the issue of nuclear disarmament, because the original date for the Olympics, 2020, is the 75th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So an original proposal had been made by the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that those 2 cities would co-host the Olympics and they'd be called the Peace Olympics. But that got turned down by the Japanese government and they put forward the Tokyo bid. So Tokyo won the Olympics. So as you mentioned, there has been then at least the appeal to, at least mention something about this peace by having a moment's silence. And the best day for that during the Olympics would be August 6th. And as you mentioned just yesterday, that was turned down by the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. And beyond that, the Japanese government in 2019 was putting forward these Olympics as being the recovery Olympics, not the peace Olympics, but recovery, demonstrating that Japan was okay now, that they recovered from the tsunami and from Fukushima and everything was okay. And then there's this whole issue of how to deal with the pandemic and holding Olympics at a time when the rates of COVID cases are skyrocketing, they're going up. 10,000 new cases reported in Japan on Friday. And so there seems to be a disparity between the ideal of the Olympics and the ideals of peace. And nuclear games comes right in the middle of that to highlight stories of peace and disarmament and to engage in new ways through storytelling. It's not specifically about Japan, it's about the nuclear story as a whole around the world, and to tell stories and to engage people, and to do it in a way that also provides easy access to historical information and other footage once you've attracted people. So that's a bit of the introduction to it, of why it was launched on the eve of the Olympics, why it was called Nuclear Games, to juxtapose and contrast between negative games, games towards disaster or races towards disaster, and positive games, which is what the Olympic Games should have been and the ideal of the games. But the platform, the project goes way beyond the games and will continue, and we're already getting engagement, and it will take forward to engage not only youth but others in these issues. And so with that introduction, I'll pass on to Vanda, who'll say a little bit more about what Nuclear Games actually is. Thank you.
Okay. Vanda, please explain to us. We old fogies were brought up in Britain. It was a 4-minute warning we were going to get of the end of the world. I think it was 21 minutes in the States, was it? They had time to duck and cover. We didn't. And, even at school, we had air raid warnings and all clear warnings, just to be sure. There was Civil Defense Corps, who was, I think, mostly there to pick up the bodies afterwards. I couldn't see what else they were doing. So we were intensely involved in this. There were massive anti-nuclear protests in London and other places at the time. So what happened? Why has everyone got complacent? Why are you trying to re-energize young people about it?
So thank you so much. And I'm just quickly follow up to this. I think that's part of the issue, because young people we haven't lived through this. We haven't sort of lived through a crisis similar to what you've been describing. So we don't really have that urgency in us. But let me just get to this one thing at a time. So hello everyone. So good to be here. My name is Vanda, and I'm one of the 2 conveners of Abolition 2000 Youth Network, also known as Youth Fusion, and I'm also the vice chair of Prague-Vision Institute for Sustainable Security. And so in my job, I get to talk to experts and academics and civil society representatives and legislators, and then so many people, but also young leaders from around the globe. And it's so sad to me, and it so often happens that I'm at a conference or now a webinar these days, and I'm the youngest person there. And then like the second youngest person is still 30 years older than I am. And it's a struggle. So that's something that I've been wanting to change. And in my eyes, is something that Nuclear Games could really help us with. In my eyes, young people aren't just the future, we're the present as well. So I'm really beyond grateful for platforms such as Nuclear Games, which can help us change this and bring more people to the table by educating them on these issues of our nuclear history and then engaging them in that movement afterwards. So what is Nuclear Games? More on the technical side as well. It's an online platform which contains essentially 2 big products. First is an animated film or an animated movie, a bit over an hour long. And then the second product is the so-called web documentary. It's a brand new innovative product. I think for the first 2 months, cooperating with the producer, Docmine, on this, I didn't understand fully what exactly it meant and what it stood for. But basically, it's an online platform about the 5 stories that Alan's mentioned. And it engages with you, and you engage with the different stories. You can click on things, you can zoom in and zoom out, really be part of the story almost. You can watch different videos, you can read up on different stories. If there's something specific that you want really more information even, you can dive deeper and deeper into the facts and into the stories behind certain things. The web documentary platform also includes the so-called library or a knowledge board, where one can search for even more detailed information, which is really just a directory of the different facts and statistics and that. So the 5 stories, as Alan's mentioned, is the Cuba, Niger, Chernobyl, Bikini, and North Korea. And the whole platform is available in English, in German, and we're very excited that a Japanese version is in the works and should be available by the end of the summer. So we're really trying to make this platform accessible to as many people everywhere. We're trying to diminish the language barrier as well. So it is, the word exciting is be used a lot today, because the education of the nuclear history is really not part of the, I want to say, the majority of curriculums in both high schools and universities worldwide. So often, as part of Youth Fusion, we speak with university students who study international relations or security studies or global governance, or honestly, any major where you'd expect the professors to really cover the area of Cold War and then nuclear deterrence and then these very big issues. But so often we meet students who have not, maybe they've heard about the topic, but they wouldn't know the details, they wouldn't know what it was about. And even if there is a student that is interested in nuclear weapons or something, they're being referred to decades old academic articles, which simply aren't a pleasure to read. So nuclear games could in a way facilitate this to them now, because it's an innovative new platform that's done so engagingly, definitely much more than an academic article. So I think it'll stay with people, and not just with students, but really with older generations as well, just because it's taking this human-centered approach and then the storytelling approach that Alan's talked about. So Youth Fusion really is honored to be a partner to Docmine, the producer of nuclear games, on this, because it also touches, the whole platform touches on two big issues that that Youth Fusion deals with, and that's intergenerational dialogue and really how nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament links to the broader field of sustainability and sustainable development. So on the intergenerational dialogue aspect, we believe that the young generation have a lot to learn from those who have been before us and those who are maybe now in charge, but not only from their expertise, but also from their mistakes. And nuclear games does exactly that. It educates us on the history of the nuclear chain, really from uranium mining to nuclear weapon testing. And then on the interlinks of nuclear disarmament to the broader field of sustainable development, we all are familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which we constantly talk about how they can't be achieved unless we look at them together and leave no one behind. So nuclear games also helps us really showcase how peacemaking or nuclear disarmament is connected to climate change and resilient societies and sustainable cities and many more of those goals that we're trying to achieve then in less than a decade now.
If I can come in, going to have to play a little bit of devil's advocate because some of our correspondents actually approached us. Is there a danger that by conflating civil and military nuclear power, you're engaging in scaremongering? And the second, following on from that, is that several people think, well, one of the issues that one of our correspondents brought up was that New York's CO2 generation shot up 32% when they closed Indian Point, the nuclear reactor on the Hudson. So the question is, a lot of people, whether we agree with them or not, are advocating that nuclear power is one of the solutions to some of the SDGs on reduction of CO2. So by conflating this with bombs on Hiroshima, are you doing the environment and the world a disservice?
So I'll give a response to this first, and Wanda might have something else. Firstly, it's true that at the moment, there's a certain portion of energy that is being produced by nuclear energy, and that may be useful for the time being. But in terms of addressing climate change, we have to quickly replace fossil fuels with alternatives. And nuclear energy is not the way to go about that because, one, it takes too long to come online. We have to work fast on replacing the fossil fuels with renewable energies. And to build a nuclear power plant with the planning process and all that takes about 10 years. It's also very expensive. And there are problems that still aren't resolved. What to do with the radioactive waste that's dangerous for countless generations. And the risks of nuclear accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima. So the answer is we actually have better alternatives to nuclear energy that come online much faster. Solar panels, wind turbines, even wave energy, which has been developed, come on much faster than than a nuclear energy, and so can meet the goals. This is why the International Renewable Energy Agency, which is a government, a treaty-based body with 170 member governments, does not put nuclear energy as a solution to the climate change process. They don't include it as a renewable energy. They have a range of other sources and technical support to countries in order to phase out their reliance on fossil fuels and replace with renewable energies, and that doesn't include nuclear energy.
I just take an example. France, or 70% of its energy is met by nuclear power, and Germany closed all of its nuclear power stations down. And even though I don't advocate nuclear energy, is a decision like that wise when you've already all the sunken costs in terms of the environment, the development, the heavy capital expenditure have already been met? So wouldn't it have been better to continue them until the time comes to mothball them and just promise not to replace them?
Well, the quicker you phase them out, then the quicker that you can build in the alternatives, which is replacing the fossil fuels with renewable energy, which is safer. The other aspect of renewable energy, which I didn't mention, is it's much better in developing countries, because in the developing countries, you don't need a centralized support source of energy, because the energy grid and getting the electricity out to the communities is not that good. You need decentralized production of energy sources. Nuclear energy is not a decentralized one. It's a very centralized one. It doesn't meet community energy needs, whereas the renewable energies do. And again, as I mentioned, they come online so much faster than if you're building nuclear energy. So what Switzerland, Germany, and a number of other countries who originally invested quite a lot in nuclear energy are doing is phasing out their reliance on nuclear energy, as is Sweden. There are other countries like New Zealand, which never decided to go down that line.
One of our ghost panelists who helped arrange this, Stephen Kent, has just replied to that question. Stephen, can you put your mic on and give us your answer there that you've just texted in?
Sure. I've been involved with Indian Point, first working to shut it down, and then watchdogging its decommissioning for about 25 years. I can tell you, and I can give sources to any journalists who are interested, Indian Point never contributed 32% of state power. It was well under 20%, but after 9/11, they stopped publishing where the contracts would go and so forth. Most of its power was wheeled out of state. This was a kind of public relations spin that was put on the output in order to argue for subsidies. In any case, I've dug deeply into the New York Independent System Operator data, as have colleagues of mine. I can give you sources on that too. It shows clearly that renewables and efficiency in New York State have already replaced about 3/4 of Indian Point's power. It was well on the way to doing so even before it shut down, and the last reactor shut down in April. And it will replace the rest of the power sometime in the next 2 years.
Thanks, Stephen. I'd like to point out that Indian Point is traditional. It's in a fairly fragile tectonic zone. It's actually on the banks of one of the most polluted river systems in the country, the Hudson, and is within a nuclear, let's say a secondary nuclear strike. A small tactical weapon on Indian Point would have done, let us say, more damage, considerably more damage to Manhattan than 9/11 did in terms of fallout and health. But that's one of the issues I want to bring in. Partly comes out in what you're saying, the film, is there is a sort of form of madness that afflicts politicians and designers. I remember your area, Alan, when the French were setting off their nukes in around Tahiti. The wind was blowing towards a nearby island, and they insisted on going ahead because Charles de Gaulle, the president, was there. And they didn't want to let him down by not letting off the fireworks. So they let this off regardless of the consequences. And similarly, it's the complete disregard for the consequences on the locals, like in Bikini. I've spoken to them. I've actually interviewed the kids from Chernobyl who were in Cuba, in the sanatoria there. And it's this, how should I say, insouciance by the authorities to the effects of their decisions that really worries. They do not seem to behave rationally. There is some form of nuclear madness when it comes. And a part of this is because would you estimate how the nuclear power industry, how closely it's tied to the nuclear energy industries, nuclear weapons industry? I mean, certainly I know from Britain and France that a lot of the nuclear power industry was simply a cover for their acquirements of their acquiring nuclear weapons. They had to do this to get the plutonium.
Yeah, well, it's not the only reason for nuclear energy, but it definitely is one. That if you are developing nuclear energy, then it's not too difficult, if you so decide, to then move towards a nuclear weapons program. Because for any nuclear weapon, you need either highly enriched uranium or plutonium. And the highly enriched uranium is produced in the same way that you produce the uranium for a normal nuclear reactor. And the plutonium is what comes out the other end of a nuclear reactor. And you basically extract it.
This is how you can make bombs out of clinker ash from thermal power stations.
Yeah, so that's why if you are thinking that you might want to make a nuclear bomb, the best first step is to start developing a nuclear energy program. And then that provides you basically the jump start if you then decide you want a nuclear bomb. That's why people are so concerned about the Iranian nuclear power program, because it could give the Iranians, if they so decide, the capacity to develop nuclear weapons. They haven't at the moment, they haven't so far, but that's what they could do if they so decided, because they have the uranium enrichment facilities. So that's part of the connection, but it's not the only. The nuclear power industry is also doing it for money. I mean, these are big, expensive items. There is money to be made in it. And because it's such a big ticket item, one nuclear power plant that you're producing could be $2 billion. It's ripe for corruption, kickbacks. And there's so many examples of that where politicians can make money out of organizing contracts for nuclear energy system. They can't quite do the same with renewable energies, because renewable energies can be bought by individuals, by small villages. It's so much more egalitarian, renewable energies, whereas nuclear energy fits into much more of the mega structures where there can be corruptions and power plays. So that's another of the dynamics there. It's not only about the connection with the nuclear weapons, it's also connection with power and with corruption and with money making. Again, that's not a good reason for developing nuclear energy.
We're in an era where we're continually told about the superiority of private enterprise. Are there any serious nuclear programs that haven't had major state subventions or investment?
Yeah, I should just mention, though, that while we're on the program here, that the stories, some are about nuclear energy, but also about the nuclear weapons. It's not just a debate about the nuclear energy. It's also about the nuclear weapons. And when you say conflate, they aren't the same politically. There are different political reasons for nuclear weapons and different reasons for nuclear energy. So even though this tells stories of both, it doesn't say it's the same. It doesn't say they're the same story. These are 5 stories of the nuclear age, picking up on, again, what the impact on people is. That's sort of the key entry point for nuclear games. The entry point is not the politics. The entry point is the impact on people.
I think one of the most telling of your anecdotes is about the Soviet naval officer who single-handedly said, no, you've got to think carefully before you let off that nuclear torpedo. And there was another case with a Russian military officer who thought that the submarine was under attack and were about to let it off. But I think it was the political commissar, usually the baddie in all of these spy movies, who said, no, comrades, we have to think carefully about this. So I was really impressed with those personal anecdotes. I mean, these people are world heroes. There should be monuments to them. The people who said no when the time was appropriate. Are there any more like that you didn't include or you would put in future anecdotes?
Arlen, do you want to go first? No, I just wanted to go just quickly link back that really the human-centered approach is what also ties all of the stories together, just focusing on these personal stories in the background. And I think that's because many people that I have at least personally talked to do consider the Cuban Missile Crisis as like the story they most enjoy from the five. And I think it's because this is one of like the most talked about issues from the history. If we were to cover nuclear weapons at school, it would probably touch the Cuban Missile Crisis, but for sure we did not hear about the personal story of this specific person and like the relations behind that. And I think the stories really are so powerful in telling. We've been with Youth Fusion, we've been screening the Man Who Saved the World movie featuring Stanislav Petrov, who's the person, another person who saved the world, who the world really doesn't know about at all, which is a shame.
Well, just looking at the film tends to defer to traditional Western hagiography about, for example, John F. Kennedy. When I actually lived through it, I was very young, but for many people in Britain, it was Nikita Khrushchev who was the hero, who was prepared to compromise in ways that actually cost him politically. He agreed, he got the trade-off, he got the missiles out of, American missiles out of Turkey, which was a valid point to make, in return for the Soviet missiles out of Cuba, but he also agreed to tick the no publicity box. So Kennedy's ego and political standing could be massaged back home. And he paid a price for it. He was fired. I mean, Nikita Khrushchev is no one's very genial, but he's no one's cuddly uncle when you come down to it. But he was a hidden hero here, whose view in the traditional iconography of West and East has not been given due recognition over Cuba, I think.
Absolutely. And I think in general, the movie is sort of pointing out how the Western world is sort of, I don't want to use the word exploiting, but exploiting some of the areas that are foreign that we don't really see and don't realize the effects of our actions. The Niger story, the bikini stories are exactly that. The Western countries doing their thing far, far away, so they don't see the effects. But that's also something that I wanted to say with the first questions, asking about, you know, the people who are in favor of nuclear energy. That's so often people that don't live close to a power plant, that are not directly affected by it, and are not in any possible danger if something were to happen. I almost accidentally was part of a big conversation on Instagram, I think it was, around nuclear energy. And there was a girl just making her point that she lives close to a nuclear power plant and that she has to live with them. They have a pill. If something happens, they have to swallow the pill real quickly. And that's something so many people don't know and don't realize. So of course, it's so easy to advocate for this big nuclear plant when if something goes wrong, it's not going to touch me. So I'm really happy that we're covering these stories that are happening far, far away from us. So it's making us realize what actual actions can our decisions make, because it's crazy that we're not educated about them enough.
Well, Frank Gomez has raised a point about one of your films there. Are the French still mining uranium in Niger? And are there deposits elsewhere in the region where weak governments might be susceptible? This is the Sahel. This is an area where the US military has a task force now, the Africa Command, and the French have extensive military where they're trying to rope the rest of the world in to defend it. To what extent is the nuclear issue, a major point of difference causing the fission in these societies? The film makes the point it's the Tuareg nomads who are suffering, but the government is well, careless, because they're not Tuaregs. They are coastal.
So a quick response to that. I do understand that the French mining in Niger is supposed to be closing down this year because of depletion of the reserves, but that's not the key point, because this impact is going to continue. You know, and this is what, you know, some of these stories show, you know, from the nuclear test in Bikini, that radiation is still there, you know, and that's going to last for generations. And it's the same with the uranium mining, you know, the release of radiation into the air, into the surrounding, into the environment from the mining, that lasts for years. And what happens when France closes up, you know, the uranium mining goes home? what happens to the people who are still suffering for like generations after that? This is part of the stories. You know, it's not just happening during the time of the tests or during the time of the uranium mining, but for countless generations.
The radiation is an interesting side point. I'm an historian of booze, of tequila and rum. And one of the things they discovered was that when they were testing for fakes, you know, people produce, you know, fake 70-year-old bottles, they test for nuclear residue. They know anything that's made since, you know, since the 60s, 50s and 60s will have nuclear radiation in it. So they can tell whether anything has been produced before or after then. And it's that pervasive in the atmosphere. As far as I know, there are still places in the north of England where they don't allow people to eat the sheep meat because they're grazing on the fells, on the high moors where the radioactivity was concentrated. And it's this pervasiveness which people overlook. Are there any anecdotes where you can really get that across of people, you know, suffering from 50-year-old radiation, 40-year-old radiation?
In Kazakhstan, we often hear from young people there, and there's a big movement building up because Kazakhstan obviously had the Semiplatynsk,
yes,
correctly, area, which was a nuclear test site. And to this day, there are people being born that are affected, you know, missing a limb or with a disability or something like that to this day. And that site's been closed for 30 years, I think. So that's, I don't think it can be any clearer than that and scarier than that. And similarly, you know, Bikini Atoll is still not safe for people to visit, and in many other places in the Pacific. I don't think we need anything more of that. It's just, yeah.
Although the geopolitical implications as well about governments. Alan is from New Zealand, and of course, I think you were alive when Greenpeace was sunk. And remember, the issue was New Zealand wouldn't allow nuclear warships into its harbors, full stop.
Yeah,
and the US put immense pressure, and the French blew up Greenpeace, the Greenpeace boat, Rainbow Warrior, to make their point.
So if people are unaware of that, that was, yes, during 1985, New Zealand had just sort of declared itself to be nuclear free. We were under an alliance with the United States and Australia, under which we had been part of a nuclear alliance. And a big civil society movement fueled partly by seeing the impact of the nuclear tests. You know, and if this is the damage that nuclear weapons does during peacetime, when people can control, you know, when they detonate a bomb, how much worse would it be during wartime? So New Zealand was very strong. The people said, we don't want the nuclear weapons. We got a government in 1984. And then 1985, we had the Rainbow Warrior, and I was helping on the boat as one of the people showing people over and educating about the nuclear tests at Mururoa. Yeah, the Rainbow Warrior was about to head over to Mururoa to protest against the nuclear tests, and it was blown up by Secret Service agents of France. But, you know, as David Lange, our Prime Minister, said at the time, the French were already shooting themselves in the foot, because if people around the world hadn't known about the French nuclear testing before that, they really found out about it once this, you know, news item that, you know, they had destroyed a peace boat. So it really galvanized the movement, and a few years later, we managed to move France to end the nuclear testing in the Pacific and close down the nuclear test site. So there are success stories, and I think that's something which is, you know,
I'll put that to my board of nuclear madness. Those whom the gods wish to send mad, they first give nuclear power to and see where it goes from there. Simon Locke is talking about France, as we said, a leader in nuclear generation. Japan. Let's look at Japan, since it's the area. It's very small land area, next to no hydrocarbon resources, very small coal fields, as far as I know, pretty much worked out. They have very little land for other forms. Why should... Give the pros and cons of a compact nuclear reactor if they put it in the right place instead of Fukushima.
Well, it's, you know, Fukushima is just one type of accident. That was where there was a tsunami, you know, and that sort of knocked out, you know, the backup.
Amazing, a
system.
tsunami on a low-lying coastal plain in a tsunami earthquake region in Japan.
Yeah. But that's just one scenario. You know, Chernobyl was a totally different scenario. I mean, Chernobyl, there wasn't a tsunami there, wasn't even an earthquake there. They were conducting a test, you know, of an accident, and then something went wrong and they didn't realize that it was actually a reality. They thought it was like the test and didn't respond in time. So it was a combination of a freak problem, you know, within the reactor, and humans not understanding exactly what was happening because of the time. 3 Mile Island was a different type of scenario. There are a range of different scenarios, and we don't know all the scenarios because often it's a combination of factors, you know, and so when you have a technology that is so dangerous, it's virtually impossible to prevent any type of accident from happening. And the problem with a nuclear power is that if you have an accident, it can be incredibly dangerous. And so that's where there is, you know, an impetus, you know, to be able to work for alternative sources. Japan is moving along on renewable energies and is putting, you know, a lot of technology into that. There's more that could be done, but there's a lot of resource that is really untapped so far on the renewable energy field, and that's the ocean. You know, the ocean has an incredible amount of kinetic energy, and we're only just starting to tap that. And the kinetic energy can be tapped in ways that are not damaging to the environment, whether that's turbines on the ocean floor, whether it's wave currents, whether it's a temperature differential in the oceans, and tidal. There's like 4 different ways that you can generate energy, the electricity from the oceans, and it's only just touching the surface of that so far. And countries like Japan, surrounded by the ocean, or New Zealand, my country, we've got, you know, lots of potential for that. In New Zealand, we don't really need to because we've got other sources and we can meet our energy needs through other renewable energies. But, you know, there are options that can be developed in countries which are slightly different.
You mentioned Chernobyl, and one day you were talking about the importance of personal stories. I actually have met firefighters who were drafted in from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to go and fight at Chernobyl. Mostly they survived. At least one sort of relative in-law died as a result of it all. But I mean, that was one of the most chilling things. What did you call them? The cleaners, the guys who were sent in with shovels to move the radiation, and they could do it on 90-second shifts, and they still ended up incredibly ill. They had to get the nuclear debris through the hole, dropped in, very low tech, shovels, lead aprons from the looks of it. But the amount of thought, there were helicopter pilots who flew into the plume. And I gathered that some of them knew exactly what they were doing, that they were going to die as a result of this, to drop the concrete and the lead in. They flew right in there. And these stories are really telling about the consequences which fairly heroic people rose to meet afterwards.
Yeah, I think what most people don't realize is the high level of radiation that's created by nuclear energy. You know, the reaction, of course, is the same as in a nuclear bomb. It's splitting atoms, you know, and the splitting of the atoms creates a huge amount of energy. But in a nuclear bomb, it's all done in like a microsecond, whereas in a nuclear power plant, it keeps going more slowly, but spread over time. But the amount of buildup of radiation, you know, in Chernobyl, for example, was more than hundreds of nuclear bombs worth. So that's why the radiation was incredibly intense, the amount that was released. And the depositing of that radiation over Europe was more on Europe than the nuclear tests, you know, in Kazakhstan, in terms of the, you know, amount of radiation that was deposited over other countries. And so again, it just indicates again the level of risk we're dealing with when we're talking about nuclear energy.
I recently saw a documentary, so-called, by somebody questioning the whole issue of Fukushima, claiming that only one person had died in there. What was the casualty rate of Fukushima? What is the casualty rate? Because I presume it's continuing.
I think I'm not sure I have the correct number. I think I remember 300,000, but am I wrong?
Was that people evacuated or people actually ill? Because I mean,
People
you could call them anti-vaxxers, but the people are saying that the evacuation was unnecessary and the evacuation killed more people through nervous stress at moving from their homes than the actual radiation. So I mean, these are the stories that are going around if you need to counter them.
The number game is quite difficult with regards to radiation because you can get an illness that may be induced by the radiation, or it may be induced by something else. And so sometimes it's quite difficult. And so we've seen this like in Chernobyl, for example, that there were, and also in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are a lot of people who it appears, had the types of illnesses that are attributable to radiation sickness. But the medical profession, because of instructions from government, said, no, you can't attribute that to either the nuclear bomb.
That's been well documented. I mean, there are US files that show that doctors were under instructions to,
yes,
died of a cold. It wasn't radiation.
So we don't know. The way generally, when we're looking at what is the best estimate, is we have to use more statistical models of like, how much that would impact the population, and then do sampling and see if that correlates with those types of illnesses. And so, for example, and we don't know from Fukushima because a lot of the impact is latent. It happens a lot later. But the Fukushima, the radiation didn't go up into the atmosphere near as much as Chernobyl. And it's more in the earth and the groundwater. And so the rate is probably going to be a lot lower than Chernobyl, even if the radiation was somewhat equivalent, although I think a bit more from Chernobyl. But because Chernobyl went up in the air, it got dispersed a lot wider. There was a lot more pickup of the radiation from population. The Russian Academy of Sciences estimated that over the course of 50 to 100 years, because it takes time, and you're not just talking about first generation, but second and third generation impact, probably Chernobyl would impact the lives severely of about 900,000 people. But that's a statistical estimate. They can't determine precisely because, as you say, people were brought in from all over the Soviet Union back then, brought in from over the Soviet Union and sent back, like thousands and thousands of people, over the course of the cleanup. And the health the governments haven't followed up with those people, so we don't have proper statistics on.
That was one of the most telling stories in the video about the firefighter whose pregnant wife insisted on hugging him, even though she was told to keep a distance. And it was sort of a premonition of COVID isolation. He was dying, and I don't think people hadn't got around to telling him he was dead. he was walking. Well, he wasn't walking. He was the supine dead at the time. He was a death certificate waiting to happen. But they told him his wife not to embrace him, and she did. And the baby died 4 months after birth.
But again, it's not just that, and it goes with the numbers. We're just still uncovering how many people have cancer in the Pacific Islands specifically. The Murora files are exploring how many people to this day that are born there or living there now. Of course, not in their original homes, but in other islands that have very high cancer rates because of this. And then the French government's ignoring that and not giving proper healthcare and all that. That's a different story. But and again, those are people that were not there during the testing. They were born not in the specific area, but close by decades later and are still affected. And it's very, very hard to put the actual numbers together. But just want to say that we should not be neglecting those aspects as well, because they're very, very powerful as well.
Well, the lies, damned lies and statistics, Churchill said, in order of magnitude, and medical statistics you showed in your documentary on Niger, how the doctors were basically, no one was to die of radiation sickness, even if they'd been eating the yellow cake, with jam and cream on top. They were dying of anything except radiation poisoning, until the team went along and examined from the WHO, was it? Who was it, the team that went along and measured the radioactivity in that film? No, okay, sorry, I watched it yesterday, I should remember. Have to forgive my adult brain. So is there anything else? What's the next stage for your campaign before we wind up?
We're just getting started.
We have something coming up on August the 29th, which is
the half-life of this program is fairly short. We have to close.
Yeah. It's August 29th is the International Day Against Nuclear Tests, and it's a day to develop some more awareness about the impact of the nuclear weapons and their testing. And Youth Fusion has got a cooperative project with the UN Office of Disarmed Affairs, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, and the government of Kazakhstan to highlight, the impact of nuclear tests around the world and to get young people engaged. I think, Vanda, you can say what the action is.
Yeah, so it's the hashtag Step Up for Disarmament campaign, and we're basically asking not just young people, but again, their families, the networks, to run or walk 8.3 kilometers or do, I think, 10,000 and something steps to raise awareness, and then to bring it online, share their stories, and just to remember and commemorate the International Day Against Nuclear Tests. So I think that's a great initiative, and it's also great because it's anyone, anywhere can do it, anywhere around the globe, which, linking it back to nuclear games, also, hopefully, anyone, anywhere can watch and engage with. And in terms of the next steps for nuclear games, we're very much open for different organizations to screen the movie. Of course, we hope that as many people will get engaged with the web documentary. There's also possible talks about a sixth story somewhere in the future. So we're excited. We're honored by the feedback we're getting on the platform. We're trying to get universities engaged as well. So there is.
Well, several have already been in touch with us asking about the screening. So there'll be any of you out there who want to arrange a screening. You've got Vanda's address and Alan's address, email on the site. Please get in touch, but we will be happy to facilitate.
Absolutely. Yeah, Docmine, the producer and the owner of the actual product, is very much open to talks about how to do different screenings and how to facilitate them. And Youth Fusion is beyond happy to help with the process. Again, we just want the word to get out there and educate and involve as many people. And I think it'll be great.
I'll just add a little bit on the question you raised about are there other incidents where we were very close to nuclear war and someone stepped in, and the answer is yes, there have been other incidents. We don't know them all because some of them are classified information, but we hear about them.
Probably locked up for 30 years afterwards.
But we heard one, for example, again from the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the commander involved couldn't talk about until 50 years after because it's classified. There was an actual order for the US to fire nuclear weapons against China. And this was like the commander who was involved in the nuclear weapons, which were deployed around Japan, thought this was crazy order. Why would we be firing nuclear weapons against China? This is a Cuban Missile Crisis. And they realized that when he sent back the question to the head command back in the US, they'd sent the wrong code to them. It wasn't a firing code that they had intended to send.
They used to have Cuban Chinese restaurants in New York. Obviously, this has got across them.
The problem we have is we have options of first use of nuclear weapons, weapons on alert, weapons to be fired and on warning. So there's a high level of preparation, operational readiness to use nuclear weapons, which means when you have a mistake like this or a miscommunication, misinformation, you could have a nuclear disaster. So one of the key things, the campaigns is to call on the nuclear armed states to step back from the brink, to say we won't use nuclear weapons first, we'll take the weapons off alert, and put diplomacy first in these and communication before responding knee-jerk reaction with nuclear weapons. So no first.
So which of the overtly nuclear powers actually have a no first use policy at the moment?
So India and China have both declared no first use policies, but there is a lack of confidence from other countries that they actually mean it. You know, it's like, is it something which they would stick to it in a crisis? And in fact, there are sort of been counter messages coming from both countries, you know, particularly China now with the conflicts arising in the South China Sea, the conflict over Taiwan, for example. There are sort of indications that, you know, maybe China would flex its nuclear muscle and not stick to a no first use policy. So a no first use declaration has to be accompanied by operational measures to step the forces back. And you know, decouple the weapons so that you can't just immediately launch weapons. I mean, decouple the weapons from the missiles, for example, would be a de-alerting measure that would demonstrate that you're actually genuine about a no first use pledge. President Biden is considering, he's quite supportive of no first use, and they've just started, the US has just started a strategic stability dialogue with Russia. So it could be quite possible that Putin and Biden might agree to no first use. But again, in order to have confidence that each other is agreeing to that, they would need to sort of do actual physical measures on their weapon systems to demonstrate that they mean no first use and are not just declaring it. So this is part of the dialogue at the moment. It's part of the US nuclear posture review.
Okay, last word, Wanda, before we go.
Ooh, thank you. I just wanted to say that
Famous last words.
Famous last words. To the reporters here, I just want to stress that young people around the globe are interested in these issues of disarmament and peacemaking, and I know that because I talk to them daily, and I'm one of them. But the media coverage of their actions and movements are simply lacking, which can be very discouraging sometimes, especially when we compare it to other important movements such as Fridays for Future or any of the climate change movements. So, and as we know that these fields are very much interlinked and interconnected, I really think that, you know, the young people working towards sustainable peace deserve more media attention. So that's my urge to everyone who's listening to sort of give nuclear games a boost. Because there are many, many people involved. This is not a passive issue. It just needs a bit of a boost in terms of promotion. So those are my wise words for the end.
Caitlin, do you have a chyron for the next shows coming up, for the next web broadcast? Yes. Okay, roll with them. This is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association in New York, saying goodbye, and thank you very much to Alan and Wanda for the discussion, which has been open-minded. We've raised the issue. We've been critically supportive. So here we have a fairly dazzling selection: Beyond Earth, Solar Power from Space, which is another place. You know, it's fairly sunny in the south of Japan, in Hiroshima, for example. That's this week, God heavens. With John Mankins and Tony DeTora about how microwave energy can be collected from the sun and broadcast down to Earth. We have one on the UN Food System Summit with renowned food expert on commercial exploitation of foods, Marian Nessel. Coming up soon, we have the US-Russia triangle with an ambassadors roundtable. We have a decade with Peter Jennings, and we have some more coming up as well. So please, do register, do join the Foreign Press Association as an associate or a member, and do help us. Do feel free to donate anytime, but get in touch and keep in touch. Thank you very much, and we'll see you on August the 5th, the day before Hiroshima. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
Okay. Bye, everybody.